But, going beyond the Chinese, I think is justified because we need to do something to change the trade status quo. And I don't think other countries are going to cooperate unless we threaten them. Mike, thanks for doing this.
I'm happy to do it.
So we agree on a lot on trade, but I want to focus on what we disagree on. I think the situation for our American workers who have been made less competitive by globalization is bad enough that we should take trade actions that don't make a lot of sense otherwise. We should sometimes impose tariffs or target other companies or try to threaten bad actors because those workers are in a position where that's the best policy for the U.S. right now.
So I would prefer to use tariffs as a threat very sparingly. I think you can make a reasonable argument for imposing tariffs against China, given some of their intellectual property practices and other bad practices. I think that has gotten to the point, and enough time has gone by that extremely aggressive action is warranted. In terms of trying to address the situation that American workers find themselves in, I don't think that raising the prices for the goods that they want to consume is the right solution. I think it may help workers in some pockets of the economy over a short-term period. I think it would hurt workers on balance. I think it would hurt upper income households as well, and we should be considering their welfare. And I think that there are other policy tools we can use besides tariffs to help those workers who are hurt by international trade. And we should be turning to those measures first. And we have not really exhausted those measures by any stretch as well. So there's some low-hanging policy fruit that I think we can exploit before turning to something like tariffs.
I want to get to that, but that where we might agree on that, and like I said, I want to focus on where we disagree. You're making a standard argument, which I is fine. I don't think it's a terrible argument of let's judge how good our partners are, and they're really bad partners, and we should act against them with not ideal trade policies, but they're pushing us to that way. And then there are better partners, and we should just go with the status quo in those situations, or mostly the status quo. And my point is a little stronger than that. I don't think your point's unreasonable at all, but my point's a little stronger than that, which is we've lost a lot of manufacturing jobs. We've had depressed wages. We have a group of, as you know very well, we have a group of workers in the countries that don't have the skill set to hold good jobs and support their families. That's caused social problems. It could be linked to the opioid crisis to some extent. So I'm not saying it's fair to pick out decent partners. I mean, they're not perfect, but neither are we. I'm not saying it's fair to pick out decent partners. I'm saying that's what we have to do in the United States right now. The U.S. in 2018 is not the same as the U.S. in 1998. And of course we should deal with bad partners. You and I agree on that. That's long overdue. I don't want us to just threaten the Canadians because we don't like their prime minister or something silly like that. But I do think that American workers need more protection. Now, that gets to the second point. You think that there are other options that we could, go to before we go to trade. Okay. Are those other options going to help in the next couple of years? Or are they going to help 15, 20 years from now and we improve the education system and so on?
Well, hopefully both. I don't think American workers need more protection. I think American workers need more opportunity. It certainly is the case that America in 2018 is different than America in 1998. It's also the case that America in 1998 was different than America in 1978. And if you take a longer view, the major threat to workers has not been trade. The major threat to workers has been displacement due to technology and the changing dynamics in the economy. And we need to do better at providing opportunity to workers who risk being displaced by whatever changes they're facing, whether those be trade, whether those be automation, whether those be institutions in the labor market that are no longer as strong as they once were, or whatever the reason.
I agree with that. I just think it can be used, and I'm not saying you're doing it, but it can be used as an easy excuse, which is, hey, trade's not even 50% of the problem. If you had to take a realistic view of the U.S. economy, trade's not that important except when it gets quite extreme conditions. So let's not focus on trade. All right, but we're not doing the other things. And one of the opportunities that we would create for American workers is to export more. And we've given our, even our friends, plenty of opportunity to be better trade partners. We don't owe the world by far the largest current account deficit. We don't owe the world American excess demand. So one of the opportunities we would create for our workers is exporting more, which, everybody wants, but it doesn't happen. And then the other opportunities, I don't want them to get in the way of the right trade policy. I don't, is there something about what you want to do on the domestic side that would conflict with a more aggressive trade policy? I mean, why can't we do them both at the same time?
Well, I think it gets to the question of what the right trade policy is, and I think the right trade policy is free trade. Again, I think you can point to China and say, okay, China is violating international norms. China is engaging in an outright theft of our intellectual property, and we have to take some punitive measures that we wouldn't otherwise want to take. But I think with respect to the countries that are in question in current policy debates, the EU countries, Canada, Mexico, we should have a posture of free trade, in my view, toward those countries, and we should be working on taking down any remaining protectionist barriers, not erecting new ones.
Okay, let me come at it from that perspective. Our colleague Mark Thiessen recently called the president a radical free trader, which I don't think is true.
I noticed that.
But it fits with what you just said to some extent, which is, can we threaten people, decent partners? They're not necessarily perfect. Sometimes there are countries in Asia that manipulate their currency. There are countries that use domestic politics to erect non-tariff barriers by geographic indicators, various things that block American goods and make American goods and services less competitive for poor reasons. Can we threaten them to get to a zero tariff outcome? Can we say, we're going to threaten pretty much everyone, and a lot of people think that's what the Trump administration is doing on trade, and then we're going to say, oh look, Mexico's responding right now, so let's make a deal with Mexico. The EU may be responding right now, let's make a deal with the EU. Japan, if they're not responding, well, then they're going to get the ugly side. They're going to get the stick instead of the carrot. Would you with the goal, which the president may or may not have, of really reducing trade barriers and creating more opportunities for American workers, would you then think that threatening our partners, even our decent partners, is a good idea?
No. I would be very surprised if, well, first of all, I would be surprised if I encountered evidence that this were an organized strategy. I think that a better explanation for the president's behavior is that he has clearly protectionist instincts, that he really does believe that if we import more from one country than we export to that specific country, that we're somehow losing in a zero-sum sense, as opposed to just engaging in trade for mutual benefit. So my sense is that is not what the president is attempting to do. But if it were, I would be very surprised if it would work. It's very difficult to create these trade agreements, as we saw with TPP, for perhaps the most recent example. It is the case that countries that are engaged in these agreements are under tremendous pressure domestically to protect certain industries, and that's why there are some remaining high tariff rates that the president has been able to point out. Tariffs on dairy products from Canada, for example. The United States has similar issues, tariffs that we impose on tobacco imports and things like that. And the idea that some kind of bellicose rhetoric or some tweets would be enough to overcome the domestic political situation in those countries, and would be enough to actually take a trade negotiation from the start to the finish line, strikes me as wildly unrealistic. I think we saw some evidence of that with President Trump's meeting with the president of the EU Commission, where the president thought, at least according to his public rhetoric, that he'd really made some progress, but people who actually follow these issues, I think, have concluded that he really didn't. And so I think it's wildly inaccurate to suggest that the president is a radical pro-free trader. I don't see any evidence that his behavior is strategic, and I think even if his behavior were strategic, it wouldn't work.
Okay. I don't think the president's a radical free trader either. I do see evidence his behavior is strategic because we've got autos in China under the gun, and that's basically the whole trade deficit. But that kind of fits in with he's a strategic protectionist. He's not a strategic free trader. He's going after the trade deficit, which you and I agree is not the right measure. Having said all that, there is an area where we disagree, which is you've just given, and I know you didn't mean it entirely this way, but it ends up this way, a pretty good defense for, hey, we can't do anything. Right, it's not going to work. But that to me is not an acceptable outcome. We can do better with our own trade policies, but we're more open than most countries and almost all the large economies. We certainly can do better with our partner trade policies. We need, as we've said, that opportunity for American workers. So I feel like that fear of a problem, which we agree on, is undermining our attempt. Like in taking your point to the extreme, we end up doing nothing. But we've tried to talk people into things. We've tried to negotiate, nicely with a number of countries. We haven't been perfect on that, but it hasn't worked. The trade status quo isn't working for me, and I would argue it's not working politically in this country, not just with President Trump, but with Democrats as well. And we might disagree on this to some extent. I don't think it's working well economically in this country. I think we need a different trade outcome, and I don't think we get there by yapping about it. I think we get there by being more aggressive. So, speech over, I know we may not agree, but is there one thing, not talking about China, we agree on China, the Chinese need to be dealt with, they're an economic predator. But with partners that are, that are valuable partners in the United States, but they're not perfect, obviously, is there one thing we can do to put pressure on them? I mean, because otherwise we're just stuck saying, God, I wish things were different, but they're not.
Well, I think I'd question those premises. I mean, our average tariff rate is about the same as the average tariff rate of the EU, the average tariff rate of Canada. So I don't think that the United States is significantly more free trade than our major trading partners. I also don't think I would not characterize our progress on free trade as unimpressive. I think we've made considerable progress, especially if you zoom out, 60, 70 years or something like that, in liberalizing trade. I think that has accrued to the benefit of the people of the United States. It's accrued to the benefit of our trading partners as well. Global GDP has soared since World War II, along with the global volume of exports, for example. Those two are related. So I see the United States is roughly where our partners are, and I see trade liberalization as largely a success story. I think there are certainly things we can do to improve our trade agreements and to improve our terms of trade and to better manage the international trading system that we're a part of. And I think that those sorts of negotiations and deals are often imperfect and they're very difficult to cobble together, which is why I think it requires more care and more deliberativeness than kind of impulsive aggressiveness. I think when the dust settles, we'll look back on that and think it was counterproductive.
So I have two questions for you. One's nerdy and one's pretty clear. The pretty clear question is, do you think income inequality has risen since the financial crisis?
Well, I think it depends on the measure you look at. But the most recent metrics I've looked at suggest that it has not.
Okay. I mean, I feel like it has, and I could be wrong, because I feel like I see a rising stock market, I see rising housing prices, and I don't see rising wages, and I feel like there's a group of people who have done a lot better since 2009. They got hurt in 2009, no question. They've done a lot better in 2009. There's another group of people who are seeing them do better and just watching them float away in terms of income, wealth, and lifestyle.
I mean, certainly I think the rate of increase of income inequality has slowed. You can make an argument that income inequality has stabilized or even declined, but it's certainly growing more slowly than it was before the crisis.
Okay, so if that's the case, then maybe what we're seeing is a lagged effect, right? People are responding to problems in income politically now, to problems in income inequality.
Or maybe they're responding to a 10% unemployment rate.
You mean back then?
Now.
You think there's a 10% unemployment rate now?
No, maybe they are responding to the more real macroeconomic consequences of the recession.
Okay, I mean, I think income inequality is a real macroeconomic consequence. Let me ask you the nerdy question. Do you agree that productivity growth is slowing or stagnant right now?
It's certainly growing more slowly than it has in previous expansions.
Okay, so if we get that point, and this is economics, but it's also philosophy. What's the responsibility of American policymakers? When the U.S. is really productive and really competitive, free trade is good for the U.S. I mean, right? Just we're going to compete anywhere, except for the cheaters like China. We're going to compete anywhere. But when U.S. productivity growth is slowing, should the U.S. start thinking, look, it would be great if productivity growth is fast, and if it gets back to being fast, we're going to be more pro-trade. But right now, we got workers struggling in productivity. We need to help them.
I think certainly the solution for productivity is not to raise the prices that households face when they go to purchase goods, and it's not to raise the prices that businesses face when they go to purchase intermediate inputs to production like steel and aluminum and other things.
Okay, the solution for productivity is not, I mean, household prices don't bear on productivity. What I'm saying is if we have a way to restrict imports and protect jobs that it's not intermediate goods. So, it's not inputs to production. We're already doing that by substituting out oil. But if we have a way to say, look, your productivity isn't rising. There may be some people coming to take your jobs overseas because their productivity is rising. It's lower than yours, but it's catching up. And we can protect those workers. Shouldn't we do that in a low productivity environment?
I mean, the extent to which jobs are going overseas is because those workers are less productive and therefore cheaper. You want to take advantage of lower wage labor markets overseas as opposed to higher wage labor markets here.
But jobs will go overseas if the productivity gap between foreign workers and American workers narrows, right? I mean, you want the productivity wage ratio to be as good as it can. And if they're relatively more productive, that's a more attractive labor force.
Well, sure. What I'm trying to get at is I don't think productivity is the best way to think about that. If we want to improve productivity, then we need to look at the things that drive productivity and target those. I don't think that a free and open economy is one of the things that is hurting productivity growth.
Let me ask a really pointed question, which I hope is not true and you hope is not true, but I'm just going to ask it as a case. If you knew that American workers, because of weak education system, because of social problems, whatever it was, bad policy, if you knew that American workers were going to become relatively less productive compared to foreign workers over 20 years, and we were going to lose jobs because of that, do you think, even though as a sort of in basic economics, it's not rational to defend the unproductive workers, but do you think American policymakers should defend those workers? Like, if you knew that's the trajectory you're on, would you accept protectionism in that case?
I don't think the premise is correct. One of the reasons why you want to have free trade is to allow for the kind of specialization that increases productivity. Free trade is not about job creation, at least to a first approximation. What free trade is about is allowing for American workers to do the things that they're best at, and the things that they have a comparative advantage in. That should, over a long enough time period, increase productivity and increase wages in the United States. So I don't see protectionism as the solution to the problem you're outlining. I do agree that we have an issue with productivity right now, and in order to address that issue, we should be looking at the levers we have to increase productivity growth. Largely that's a mystery, but there are some things that I think we know that we can do, and I also think that we need to be looking at policy solutions for workers that are having trouble in this economy, whether or not that's from trade or from automation or from declining labor market institutions or whatever. And we need to push on some policy levers to help those workers. But I don't think that building a wall around the United States will do much of anything, at least in a macro sense, to help the American worker.
Yeah, I know, I understand what you're saying, of course. We're going, I don't want to go over the same ground, but it just seems to me that not just politically, but substantively, the trade status quo, first of all, we are allowed to change the trade status quo. The stuff where it's always been this way and it's been good for the United States, I don't care. I want to know if it's good for the United States now and in the future. We don't have an obligation to the world to pursue the same policies because they're hooked on sending excess production to the United States. But I mean, so I feel like there's a need to protect the trade status quo, to break the trade status quo, and it seems like you don't. Okay.
There's always room for improvement, of course, and we see that in NAFTA. We see that in our trade with the EU. There are things that we can do to improve the terms of trade and to better manage the system.
The fundamental argument, you can make a point that the labor union argument you were talking about before, the fundamental labor union argument isn't that they're opposed to trade. They're opposed to trade whenever it doesn't work for American workers. In other words, they liked trade when the U.S. was absolutely the dominant producer in the world in the 50s and in the 60s. And then, we would export more than we imported, and we were best in manufacturing force, best heavy industry, you name it. So they weren't opposed to trade then. They were, this seems shallow or silly on their part. They're opposed to trade when certain parts of their membership, certain parts of the United States are losing. And what I'm asking you, beyond the argument about who's a good partner and who's a bad partner, is when is it okay to decide that, as the president puts it, fairly nastily sometimes, those parts of the American labor force shouldn't lose any more to foreign competition.
I mean, I wouldn't.
It's not a question of fairness. It's just a question of what U.S. interests are.
I wouldn't look to labor unions to tell you about what's best for American workers. Unionization rates for private sector workers are at historic lows. The overwhelming majority of private sector workers are not unionized. Unions reduce employment, which is certainly bad for American workers. I think unions do a pretty good job of representing what they think are the best interests of their membership, but I don't think we should equate that with what's best for kind of workers in the aggregate.
I know I pushed the union button, and I'm sorry, and I know it causes your knee to jerk, but could you get to the trade button? The point is, why, if trade doesn't work as well for the United States as it did 40 years ago, why do we have to stick with the same trade policy?
I don't see the evidence that it's not working well for the American economy. I think that China joining the global trading system certainly was a traumatic event for a lot of local communities in the United States, for a lot of individual workers. That has largely worked its way through the system. Could that have been better managed? Sure, but there you have it. And on the whole, I think that trade has benefited workers, both in their capacity as workers, but also in their capacity as consumers. Derek, we could sit here and talk about this all day, but we need to go find more comfortable chairs. You are wise and powerful.
And you are almost as wise and almost as powerful.